She's just a waste of rations, a cowardly desk jockey, nothing more. My own mother's death sentence didn't happen in the corner of our family kitchen. It echoed through the PA system, drilling straight into the ears of hundreds of people sitting in the VFW hall. Her eyes swept over me cold, full of disgust, before she lovingly stroked the crease of the navy dress uniform on the stranger standing next to her. "Cole," she said, her voice trembling with a pride I hadn't heard aimed at me in 30 years. "You are the son, the hero that the Stout family always wanted." I just stood there. The person who kept her heart rate at a steady 60 beats per minute while listening to bullets tear through squad mates over the radio, easily having her chest ripped open by a knife from my own mother. The entire hall turned to look at me with pity. The stranger named Cole looked down gloating, but his smug grin vanished the second his eyes locked onto mine. The color drained from the elite operator's face. His chest jerked like he took a sniper round. His jaw dropped, and in a voice drowning in absolute panic, he whispered into the hot mic, Black Widow." But before I tell you why a single name made that Navy SEAL lose his mind right on the stage of his own glory, and how my mother's empire of lies completely collapsed, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and do not look away. Because no one in that room saw what was coming next. The static from the cheap microphone hissed through the stale air of the hall. The murmur of the crowd rolled over the scuffed hardwood floors, a low hum of gossip and secondhand pity. Evelyn, my mother, soaked it all up. She fed on it. She turned away from Cole and faced me, flashing a tight, heavily glossed smile. It was the performance of a lifetime. The grieving, long-suffering mother burdened with a massive disappointment of a daughter. She stepped down from the wooden podium, her cheap floral perfume cutting through the smell of old floor wax and stale beer. She reached her hand out, aiming to clap me hard on the shoulder. It was supposed to be the final touch of her act, a public display of fake forgiveness. Muscle memory is a funny thing. You can't train it out of a person. My core tightened. I didn't flinch. I didn't step away in fear. I simply shifted my weight and moved exactly one military half-step backward. Her hand swiped through empty air. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped. Evelyn's face went completely bloodless. Her jaw tightened, the skin around her eyes pulling taut with raw, unfiltered rage. She quickly pulled her hand back, forcing that plastic smile back onto her face for the hundreds of local veterans watching. She didn't realize that the half-step wasn't just a physical movement. It was a concrete wall. A boundary I drew in the dirt 10 years ago, and one I would never let her cross again. Up on the stage, Cole Mercer was still frozen. The whispered name, Black Widow, was still ringing through the speakers. In the front row, 3 active duty officers suddenly sat up straight, their posture rigid. They knew the name. The old-timers in the back didn't, but the brass did. Cole's hands started to shake. The thick stack of index cards holding his arrogant speech slipped right through his fingers. Smack, smack, smack. The heavy cardstock hit the wooden stage floor. The sound was dry and loud in the sudden suffocating quiet of the room. Cole swallowed hard. I watched his Adam's apple bob violently against his collar. A bead of cold sweat broke out at his hairline and rolled down his neck. He wasn't looking at my face anymore. His blown-out pupils were glued to the left side of my chest, to the tiny dull brass intelligence warfare pin fastened to my uniform. The guy who graduated at the top of his BUD/S class, the arrogant frogman who had just been soaking up the applause of my hometown, was now breathing like a terrified boot dropped into a live minefield. Evelyn felt the control slipping through her fingers. She couldn't stand it. She marched back up the steps, her heels clicking angrily against the wood. She ripped the microphone right out of Cole's trembling hand. "Did she scare you, Lieutenant?" Evelyn forced out a laugh. It was high-pitched, grating, and sour. "Don't mind her. She's always had that weird sullen look, ever since she was a little girl." She gripped the mic stand, leaning her weight into it, using her title as the president of the local chapter as a weapon. "You know how it is, boys. A desk worker is always going to be a little jealous of the real heroes standing on the front lines." In the back corner, a few of the old boys club guys smelling of cheap cigars and outdated opinions chuckled on cue. Evelyn was actively trying to brainwash the room. She was taking the pure, unadulterated terror of an elite special operator and trying to twist it into a cheap, sexist punchline aimed at her own flesh and blood. She wanted to bury me in the mud just to keep her stage clean. I didn't open my mouth. You don't waste breath arguing with civilians in a kill box. I kept my jaw locked. Breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold for 4. Out for 4. My heart rate stayed pinned at 60. I slowly slid my right hand into the pocket of my uniform trousers. The fabric was stiff. At the bottom of the pocket, my thumb brushed against something heavy. Cold brass. I pressed my thumb hard into the metal surface, feeling the familiar grooves carved deep into it. I stepped forward. 2 paces. Crack, crack. The heavy heels of my uniform shoes hit the floorboards like a gavel. The sound cut right through Evelyn's fake laughter. My eyes never left Cole's. I locked onto him, pinning him down like a target on a satellite feed. I pulled my hand out of my pocket, slowly. I didn't raise it high. I just held it at waist level, letting the harsh overhead lights catch the edge of the heavy metal lighter. I angled it just enough to expose the deep engraving on the brass. A massive, jagged spider, pointed dead center at his chest. It was the only key capable of blowing the doors off the brutal past my mother had tried so desperately to bury. The cold, heavy brass of the lighter in my pocket always drags my mind backward. It pulls me straight down into the memory of another piece of metal. One that was tarnished, jagged, and entirely out of my reach. I was 15 years old. The house always smelled like artificial lemon floor wax and cheap pine cleaner. It was a suffocating, sterile smell that masked the rot underneath the floorboards. I was standing at the edge of the rusted kitchen sink. My hands were buried deep in greasy dishwater, scrubbing baked-on grease off an iron skillet. The back door slammed open, rattling the loose glass in the frame. Aunt Martha shoved her way inside. She dropped a heavy black plastic garbage bag right onto the middle of the kitchen table. "Found this while clearing out the attic," she said out of breath. She ripped the plastic open. Inside lay my grandfather's original Marine Corps dress coat. The smell hit the room instantly. A heavy choking wave of mothballs, old wool, and damp basement mold. I froze. I pulled my hands out of the soapy water and wiped them frantically on the front of my stained apron. My heart started hammering against my ribs, a rapid drumbeat echoing in my ears. I stepped closer to the table. The coat was heavy, dark, and imposing. I slowly reached out. My fingers were already rough and calloused from spending hours every single day gripping the metal pull-up bar in the backyard. I did not want the fabric. I only wanted to touch the tarnished metal of the silver star pinned tightly to the left breast pocket. It was the only thing inside this entire house that I respected. Smack! The sharp crack of wood hitting bare flesh echoed off the kitchen tiles. A sudden blinding fire flared across the back of my hand. I jerked my arm back. Evelyn stood there gripping a thick wooden yardstick. A bright, angry red welt was already rising against my pale skin. "Get back!" she hissed through her teeth. Her upper lip curled in absolute disgust. She looked at me like I was a disease trying to infect a holy relic. "Military gear is not for filthy little girls." She set the yardstick down. She picked up the heavy wool coat with both hands, carefully brushing a microscopic speck of dust off the shoulder line. Then she turned her back on me and walked toward the hallway. She draped the coat over the shoulders of my cousin Rick. Rick was leaning against the door frame, loudly popping a piece of cheap bubble gum. He was a skinny, greasy-haired punk who smelled like stale cigarette smoke. The exact same kid who would get expelled from the local high school 2 years later for hiding meth in his gym locker. Rick let out a lazy smirk. He shoved his skinny arms down into the oversized sleeves. He slouched his shoulders, digging his hands deep into the pockets of my grandfather's glory, wearing it like a stolen piece of clothing from a thrift store. "Fits perfect, Aunt Evie," he mumbled around his gum. Evelyn crossed her arms and nodded. Her chest puffed out with a sickening sense of pride. "Exactly. Stout men are born to wear this." She slowly turned her head. Her eyes locked onto mine. The temperature in the room plummeted. "You," she ordered, her voice completely dead of any warmth. "Clean off this table, then go scrub the toilets. That is the only place you have any value." Aunt Martha stood next to the refrigerator, crossing her arms and sticking out her bottom lip in total agreement. two grown women teaming up to break the spirit of a 15-year-old kid. I stood there. I swallowed hard, forcing down the jagged, burning lump that was rising in my throat. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard that I tasted the warm, metallic tang of my own blood. I refused to blink. I refused to let a single drop of water fall from my eyes. Giving them my tears was like handing ammo to the enemy. I turned my back. I pushed open the heavy screen door and walked straight out into the blinding summer heat. I kept walking until I reached the dark, dusty woodshop at the back of the yard. My father's territory. The smell of fresh oak sawdust and heavy motor oil wrapped around me the second I stepped inside. It was quiet here, safe. The air was thick, but it was honest. I walked over to the heavy iron workbench. I dug through a pile of scraps until I found a small solid piece of dense oak. I reached into the toolbox and pulled out my father's carving knife. The handle was made of polished horn. The steel blade was razor sharp. I sat down on a wooden stool in the dark. I pressed the steel blade into the hard wood. Carving, scraping, shaping. I pressed too hard. The blade slipped off the edge of the wood and sliced deep into the pad of my index finger. The skin parted. Warm, dark blood immediately beaded up and dripped down onto the rough oak surface. I looked at the cut. I felt the sting. But I did not care. I did not stop. If you have ever had to bite your tongue and swallow your own tears because your family treated you like garbage while praising the absolute worst person in the room, you know exactly how this feels. You know the weight of that unfairness. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment saying, "I survived," down below. Because it takes real, brutal strength to walk away from that kind of poison and build your own life. For hours in the suffocating heat of that shop, I sat in total silence. I used the knife to shape the bloody piece of oak into a perfect flat rectangle. I found a hand drill and bored a small clean hole through the top edge. I reached into an old tackle box and pulled out a length of black paracord. I threaded the cord through the hole and tied it tightly around my neck. The wood was rough and heavy against my collarbone. If this family flat out refused to give me a rank, I would just have to commission myself. My 17th birthday arrived without a cake. It arrived with a stack of heavy cream-colored paper, the application forms for the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. I sat alone at the kitchen table, pressing a cheap ballpoint pen into the pages, so hard it left deep grooves in the cheap wood underneath. I filled out every single box using sharp, precise block letters. Each letter was a brick in the wall I was building to block out this house. The Department of Defense seal stared back at me from the top corner of the page. It was my only ticket out of the black hole of this family. I placed the finished application perfectly square in the center of the table, right next to the stained glass pot of the coffee maker. I wanted it to be seen. I needed the parental signature on the final page. Evelyn walked out of the living room. She wore a faded pink robe, dragging the hard rubber soles of her slippers across the floor. Her eyes dragged across the table and stopped on the bold print of the military letterhead. She froze. There was no screaming. There was no slamming of fists against the counter. That is the thing about true cruelty. It does not need to be loud. It does not need a build-up. She casually picked up the thick stack of paper. She held it loosely in her grip, the exact same way you would hold a dirty flyer for a septic tank cleaning service before throwing it into the garbage. Then, both of her hands gripped the top edge of the pages. Rip! The sound was dry, sharp, and incredibly violent. It sliced straight through my eardrums. I stood rooted in the doorway of the kitchen. My chest stopped moving. My lungs simply forgot how to pull in air. Evelyn slowly folded the two halves of my entire future together. She gripped them again. Rip. 4 pieces. She folded them one more time, her knuckles turning white with the effort to break the thick, stacked paper. Rip. 8 pieces. She opened her hands and let the scraps fall. They fluttered down like dead leaves, landing on the cold, greasy linoleum floor. My name. My signature. My desperate attempt to become something more than the dirt on her shoes. All of it turned into a pile of garbage resting right beneath the toes of her slippers. She did not even look at my face. She stepped right through the pile, planting her heavy heel directly onto the torn scrap of paper holding the letters of my first name. She opened the refrigerator, pulled out a plastic jug of milk, and spoke to the shelves. You are going to marry a coal miner and give him kids. Do not embarrass this family with your stupid delusions anymore." She shut the heavy metal door of the fridge and walked away. I backed out of the kitchen. I moved like a ghost down the narrow hallway and stepped into my bedroom. I pushed the door shut until the metal latch clicked. I put my back against the cheap hollow wood and slid all the way down until I hit the floor. The carpet was rough against my skin. I pulled my knees to my chest. Absolute emptiness swallowed my brain whole. My enemy did not carry a rifle. There were no incoming mortars. But I had been completely shot down and bled out on my own bedroom floor at 17 years old. The hours bled away in the dark. The digital clock on my nightstand flashed 2 in the morning. The house was dead quiet, save for the low hum of the refrigerator down the hall. Then a sound cut through the silence. A very faint, rhythmic scraping noise coming from the kitchen. I stood up. My legs felt like lead pipes. I pushed the door open just a crack and held my breath. Through the narrow gap, the kitchen was bathed in darkness. But there was a weak, yellow beam of light sweeping across the floor tiles. My father was on his hands and knees. He was pressed flat against the freezing linoleum. A heavy metal flashlight was clamped tight between his teeth. His hands, rough, cracked, and permanently stained with dark wood stain, were moving carefully across the floor. He was picking up the torn pieces of my life. I watched through the crack in the door. He placed the flashlight on the floor, aiming the beam at the flat surface of the kitchen table. He smoothed out every single jagged scrap of paper with his heavy, calloused thumbs. He pushed the edges together, forcing the torn pieces to fit back into the puzzle. He reached into the chest pocket of his canvas work shirt and pulled out a roll of clear packing tape. The sound of the tape unrolling screech was the loudest thing in the house. It was the sound of a combat medic applying a tourniquet. He taped every single tier. He taped the front. He flipped the pages over and taped the back. The rips were sealed tight. He pulled a black marker from his pocket. He uncapped it and pressed down hard, stamping his bold, heavy signature of parental consent right over the jagged lines where Evelyn had tried to kill my future. When he was done, he folded the thick, stiff application in half and shoved it deep into the breast pocket of his jacket. He looked up. He saw me standing in the shadow of the hallway. Neither of us said a single word. He walked over to me. The heavy smell of motor oil, sawdust, and old sweat rolled off his clothes. He reached out and placed his heavy hand firmly on my shoulder. His grip was solid. Grounding. "You are going to fly Belen," he whispered in the dark. "The flight starts tomorrow morning." He turned and walked out the back door. He was the only person in the world who handed me a loaded magazine when I had nothing left to fire. The United States Naval Academy at Annapolis does not care about your feelings. It does not welcome weakness. It exists to take your ego, smash it into concrete, and grind the pieces into dust on day one. The military barbers ran heavy clippers right to the scalp. Hair fell in clumps. Identity erased. Stripped down to nothing but a last name, stenciled on a canvas bag. Mornings started by choking on water in the survival pool, the sharp chemical burn of industrial chlorine searing my sinuses. Nights ended, wrapped in the stench of sour sweat and wet mud. My combat boots felt like cinder blocks bolted to my ankles. The rain came down in blinding sheets as my squad hoisted an 80-pound wooden log onto our right shoulders. Mud slid down my forehead, stinging my eyes. My calves cramped so hard the muscle fibers felt like they were ripping apart. A drill instructor marched inches from my face, spitting out cadence and commands so loud my eardrums physically ached. Any illusion I had about my own physical strength was broken in that mud. Annapolis taught me a hard truth. Precision here was not about getting a passing grade. It was the razor-thin line between breathing regular air and being zipped up inside a thick black body bag. But physical pain was easy. Your muscles adapt. The real test came when the sun dropped below the tree line. Nighttime in the barracks. The overhead lights flickered, casting a sickly yellow glow over the perfectly aligned racks. Mail call. This was the hour when mental walls crumbled. Dozens of tough, hardened recruits broke down. Guys with shoulders like linebackers buried their faces in their scratchy wool blankets, sniffing back tears as they ripped open care packages. Tupperware full of homemade cookies. Envelopes smelling faintly of their mother's perfume. The drill instructor called out names, tossing envelopes onto beds. I sat on the absolute edge of my mattress. My spine was straight. My hands rested flat on my knees. I watched the pile of mail shrink. Stout. No, that was an order to stop moving. Not my name. No packages, not a single envelope, not a postcard. My family had completely erased my existence the second I walked out that back door. Evelyn made sure of it. Total radio silence. The isolation did not creep in. It slammed down on my chest like a solid block of concrete. My throat was completely dry, feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. But my eyes were bone dry. Crying gave them power even if they were not in the room to see it. I stood up. I bent down and pulled the heavy nylon laces of my boots tight. I yanked them until the eyelets dug into the leather. I tied a hard, square knot. My anchor was not going to be found inside a perfumed envelope. It was waiting for me in the simulator. I refused to be the victim. I took the raw burning pain of being abandoned and dumped it straight into my internal furnace. It was fuel. I locked myself inside the Tactical Operations Center. The TOC. The room was freezing, the air conditioning blasting to keep the massive server racks cold. The glow from the radar monitors painted my face in a dead, ghostly blue light. I sat in the heavy leather chair, clamping the bulky headset over my ears. I forced my brain to dissect the chaos of recorded combat audio. I learned to separate the high-pitched whistle of incoming artillery from the low rumble of a diesel engine. I trained my ears to catch the microscopic crack in a pilot's voice over a staticky radio. I listened to the heavy, panicked breathing of infantrymen pinned down in a firefight. I closed my eyes. I breathed in through my nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. Box breathing. I forced my heart rate to drop. I locked it dead at 60 beats per minute. Panic is contagious. Emotion is the absolute enemy of judgment. If you feel, you hesitate. If you hesitate, people die. I turned the human part of me off. The final capstone simulation for my class was a bloodbath. The digital map on the main screen was a mess of blinking red icons. The other officers in the room were losing their minds. A lieutenant 2 seats down from me was actually shouting at his monitor, watching his simulated squad walk right into a kill zone. Panic was completely overriding his training. I sat completely still. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard. The keys clicked sharp and fast. I pulled up the thermal satellite imaging. I cut through the static, tracing the heat signatures hiding in the digital tree line. I pressed the push-to-talk button on my console. Scratch the 9 o'clock push, I ordered over the mic. My voice was flat, cold. There was not a single milligram of fear or hesitation in it. You have an ambush waiting in the blind spot. Reroute north 200 meters. Move now. The simulated squad obeyed. The red icons missed the trap entirely. My ruthless, absolute precision flipped the entire tactical board. In that freezing room staring at a blue screen, I finally found my true power. Intelligence. I did not need to kick down a door with a rifle to control the battlefield. I could see everything. I could control the board. I stood up from the console, taking off the headset. I let the heavy plastic drop onto the desk. The simulated war was over. I was ready to spin my web in a real one. It is past midnight on the African continent. The Tactical Operations Center is buried behind 2 feet of reinforced concrete, completely isolated from the oppressive desert heat outside. The room is dead quiet, bathed in the sickly, pale blue glow of a dozen satellite monitors. The heavy air conditioning units hum loudly overhead, fighting a losing battle to keep the massive server racks from melting down. The air inside smells like electrical ozone and stale burnt coffee. Suddenly, the strobe light mounted in the upper left corner of the room flashes a blinding, violent red. The primary radio channel hisses, a screech of static tears right through my headset, loud enough to physically puncture an eardrum. Out in the dirt, 2 armored Humvees carrying the elite operators of Alpha Team just lost their tires on a stretch of sharp gravel. There was no early warning. There was no radio chatter. Heavy anti-aircraft fire rips the pitch-black sky wide open. The sound of 50 caliber machine guns echoes through our control speakers, a heavy rhythmic thumping that actually shakes the floorboards beneath my boots. Their coordinates are completely compromised. The primary extraction route, Plan Alpha, is instantly shredded into garbage. On my main radar screen, 12 small green dots represent 12 breathing American suns. Those dots stop moving forward. They cluster together, pinned down in the dirt, shrinking into a tight circle of absolute desperation as the enemy closes in. The TOC explodes into chaos. The communications officers jump out of their chairs. A lieutenant standing 2 feet behind me starts screaming into a plastic handset, begging for close air support that is at least 20 minutes away. The noise is a physical weight in the room. Panic spreads like a virus. From my seat at the command console, I do not blink. I lock my jaw. Breathe in through the nose. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. My heart rate drops and pins itself exactly at 60 beats per minute. I reach out and slide the heavy audio fader down, cutting off the panicked shouting of the officers behind me. I isolate the direct feed. I only want the raw audio coming from the microphone clipped to the Alpha Team leader's chest rig. I listen to his heavy, desperate panting. I listen to the distinct sharp crack of bullets passing mere inches from his Kevlar helmet. My hands hit the heavy mechanical keyboard. The keys clack with dry, hollow snaps. I override the primary system and seize manual control of the thermal imaging satellite. I sweep a 2-mile radius around their compromised position. Heat blooms on my black screen in bright glowing orange and white. The enemy forces are pulling the net tight. But they left a seam. I scan the terrain layout and find the only open gap in a solid wall of heavy lead and fire. I press the heavy red transmission button on my console. Alpha Team, do you read? Plan Alpha is aborted. My voice broadcasts over the encrypted radio frequency. It is completely flat. It is iron. There is not a single trace of fear, panic, or hesitation in my tone. It cuts through the chaos of their firefight like a scalpel. Do not fall back. Cut to your 3 o'clock. We are moving to Route Bravo. There is a dry irrigation ditch exactly 400 meters to your northeast. Friendly suppressing fire will drop on your current coordinates in 12 seconds. Run. On the other end of the radio, there's no time to argue. There's no time to ask questions. In the dark, the voice of the intelligence officer is the voice of the Grim Reaper. Alpha Team throws themselves into the pitch-black night, trusting a voice from a continent away. They sprint toward the coordinates I fed them. The secondary routing network, a backup web I quietly built into the system hours before the mission even started, while the brass was sleeping, swallows their formation whole. The deep dirt trench shields them from the horizontal hail of bullets, just as the sky behind them erupts in friendly fire. The sun comes up over the base the next morning. The heavy steel doors of the debriefing room slide open on rusted tracks. All 12 men of Alpha Team walk inside. They are breathing. Their desert combat uniforms are caked in thick yellow mud and stiff with dried blood. The smell of cordite and sweat rolls off them in waves. The team commander does not say a single word to the senior officers standing in the corner. He walks straight to the center table and throws his heavy rifle down. The metal receiver clatters loudly against the wood. He picks up a thick red dry erase marker. He steps right up to the massive tactical map pinned to the cinderblock wall. He finds the exact coordinates of the dry ditch. He draws a heavy red circle around it. Then, with a few quick, sharp strokes, he sketches a massive, jagged spider sitting right in the center of the extraction point I navigated them to. Nobody in the room laughs. Nobody makes a joke. A heavy, dead silence settles over the hardened operators. That is the exact moment the name Black Widow starts whispering through the barracks. A phantom holding the puppet strings of the toughest men on Earth. I'm sitting at the absolute peak of my power. The girl my mother called a useless waste of rations is now a god in the dark. I hold the lives of the golden boys in the palms of my hands. Then the heavy red emergency phone on the far wall of the TOC rings. I pick up the plastic receiver. It is not the Pentagon. It is a local operator from my hometown delivering a message that cuts my strings, drops me straight out of the sky, and buries me back in the dirt. My father is dead. The news of my father's death hit me right after the extraction of Alpha Team. 3 days later, I was standing in the suffocating humidity of my hometown cemetery. I took the red-eye flight straight from the base. I was still wearing my full navy dress blues. The thick wool held the dampness of the air. The heavy metals pinned tightly against my chest were freezing cold against my ribs. A steady freezing drizzle fell from a gray sky, bouncing off the stiff brim of my officer's cover. The ground beneath my polished boots was nothing but thick, sucking yellow mud. The air was heavy, choking on the sickeningly sweet smell of white lilies and the raw stench of freshly dug clay. Directly across the open grave stood Evelyn. She was shielded from the rain by a massive black golf umbrella. Aunt Martha stood tight against her right side. Rick, the cousin who had slouched around in my grandfather's uniform years ago, stood on her left. He was wearing a cheap, wrinkled gray suit that smelled like stale smokes and desperation. For the entire duration of the service, Evelyn did not look at me. Not once. I did not exist in that family's radius. I was a ghost, crashing a private party. The local priest finished his final hollow prayer. The heavy green straps of the lowering device creaked loudly under the weight of the solid oak casket. The wooden box began its slow mechanical descent into the dark mud. This was it. The final goodbye. I stepped forward. I bit the inside of my cheek, clamping down on the raw grief trying to crawl up my throat. I pulled my white dress glove off my right hand. I bent my knees, reaching down toward a small pile of loose dirt resting near the edge of the grave. The final honor of a child dropping a handful of earth onto their father's casket. A hard, brutal force slammed directly into my ribcage. My boot slipped in the wet mud. I stumbled sideways, my arms flailing slightly to keep from falling into the open hole. Evelyn had stepped forward, dropping her umbrella entirely. She drove her sharp elbow directly into my ribs. The veins in her neck strained against her black collar. Her eyes were wide, completely bloodshot, and filled with a hatred so deep it made the cold rain feel warm. "Get back," she hissed. Her voice was a low, ugly scrape against the silence. "You do not have the right to stand here." She turned away from me, her chest heaving. She reached out and grabbed Rick by the sleeve of his cheap jacket. She yanked him forward, planting his feet right on the very edge of my father's grave. Rick did not even bend down. He kicked his foot against the pile of dirt, sending a loose clod of wet clay tumbling over the edge. Thud. The hollow, dead sound of that dirt hitting the wooden lid echoed up from the hole. That sound killed the very last ounce of hope I had left in my body. Any lingering delusion I had about blood ties died right there in the mud. Late that afternoon, I drove my rental Jeep to the house to pack up the last of my things. A massive rusted roll-off industrial dumpster was parked right in the driveway. Evelyn and Aunt Martha were dragging heavy black garbage bags out of the garage. I stopped walking. I stood on the cracked concrete. Evelyn was holding a heavy wooden crate full of my father's tools. The hand saws, the block planes, the chisels. The exact same tools that paid for the roof over her head for 40 years. Without a second of hesitation, she heaved the crate over the rusted metal rim. The heavy steel and wood crashed into the bottom of the dumpster, bearing the only legacy that man had left behind. She wanted to erase him. She wanted to bury the only source of love that had kept me breathing under her roof. She dusted her hands off. She looked right at me. She lifted her chin, daring me to scream. Daring me to throw a punch. I did not. You do not use your hands on trash. It lowers the rank on your chest. I walked past her. The cheap scent of her perfume mixed with the smell of old garbage. I leaned my body over the sharp, rusted edge of the dumpster. I pushed aside a torn piece of plastic tarp. I reached down and closed my hand around a heavy, worn wooden handle. I pulled it out. The framing hammer. The exact same hammer my father had sitting on his workbench the night he taped my military application back together. The handle was dark-stained with decades of his sweat. I pulled a clean handkerchief from my pocket and wiped the mud off the claw. I unzipped my tactical backpack and shoved the hammer deep inside, pulling the heavy zipper shut. I turned my back on Evelyn. I walked straight down the driveway toward the idling Jeep. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic blood ties to protect your own sanity, you know the exact weight of this moment. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop the comment "I walked away" down below. Because cutting the cord takes more guts than anyone realizes. I did not say goodbye. I did not look back in the rearview mirror as I shifted the Jeep into drive. The bloodline was completely severed. The desperate daughter named Balian was dead and buried. and I had a plane to catch to Bahrain. 3 years before standing in that VFW hall, I was stationed at a forward operating base in Bahrain. The heat was an absolute physical punishment. The heavy desert wind whipped loose sand across the compound, sandblasting the corrugated steel walls of the intelligence container where I worked. Inside, the air conditioning unit rattled violently, struggling to push out a thin stream of cold air. The heavy metal door was pushed open. Lieutenant Cole Mercer walked in. He was wearing full tactical gear, his heavy steel-toed combat boots hitting the metal floorboards with a loud, hollow thud. He stood tall, carrying himself with the unbearable arrogance of a guy who just graduated at the top of his BUD/S class. The Golden Boy. The exact type of man my mother worshipped. He knocked his knuckles twice against the doorframe, a lazy, hollow sound. His eyes did a quick, dismissive sweep over my bank of radar screens, then stopped on me. He looked at my small frame sitting behind a desk, and his upper lip curled in a slight, insulting smirk. "My team is infiltrating Zone Z-Ray in 2 hours," Cole said. His voice was thick with the casual disrespect that combat operators always reserve for the intelligence and support staff. "You absolutely sure you can see through their anti-aircraft grid out there, Chief? I don't want my guys walking into a blind spot because a desk jockey missed a blip." I did not look up from the monitor. My eyes stayed locked on the green thermal signatures moving across the digital map. My fingers kept adjusting the satellite frequencies on the mechanical keyboard. "Lieutenant Mercer," I said. My voice was as dry as the sand outside the door. "Your job is to aim center mass and pull the trigger. My job is to make sure you do not get roasted alive inside a downed Black Hawk before you even hit the dirt. If you do not trust my signals, go ahead and repin your safety walk over to the commander's tent and ask to abort. If not, shut your mouth and go check your ammo." Silence. Heavy and completely stagnant. I heard him swallow hard. The sound of his molars grinding together was audible over the hum of the servers. His massive ego hit a brick wall. A woman sitting in an air-conditioned box just stripped him of his arrogance in under 10 seconds. He gave a single stiff nod to the back of my head, turned on his heel, and walked right back out into the blistering heat. At 0400 hours the next morning, Zone Z-Ray turned into a slaughterhouse. The enemy intelligence was a setup. The entire area was rigged. A heavy anti-aircraft net was already laid out waiting in the dark for Cole's team. The second their transport helicopter crossed the perimeter, radio contact went to absolute static. The pilot was flying blind straight into a wall of heavy lead. I hit the red override button on my console. I completely hijacked the air traffic control system, locking out the tower. "Flight 04, hard left 60 degrees, I barked into the mic. "Emergency landing at coordinate X. That is a cleared minefield. Put it down in the dirt right now." My order ripped right through the tactical fog. It was not a suggestion. It was a command that carried the weight of absolute authority. The pilot banked hard. The heavy helicopter tipped violently sideways, dodging a heat-seeking missile by less than 20 yards. The transport slammed hard onto the cleared patch of dirt. The rotors kicked up a massive cloud of dust, but the cabin was intact. 7 lives, saved in a fraction of a second by the desk jockey. 2 days later, Alpha Team was packing up to rotate to another base. I walked into the dark, empty TOC to start my shift. There was a strange object sitting right on the corner of my keyboard. It was a solid brass Zippo lighter. The metal casing was heavily scuffed, worn down by the abrasive desert sand. I picked it up. It was heavy, cold. On the front, someone had used the tip of a combat knife to carve deep, jagged scratches into the brass. It was a spider. Underneath the spider, scraped roughly into the metal, were 4 words: Team Alpha. OU. I gripped the lighter. I snapped the heavy metal lid shut. Clack. The sharp, cold sound echoed in the empty room. Cole Mercer owed me his life. I dropped the heavy brass lighter deep into the breast pocket of my uniform. The magazine was fully loaded, waiting for the right moment to pull the trigger. The VFW hall was suffocating. The air conditioning unit in the back corner was rattling violently, doing absolutely nothing to cut through the thick humidity of the room. The air was heavy, smelling like stale draft beer, old carpet cleaner, and the sudden sharp stench of fear rolling off Cole Mercer's skin. Evelyn was losing her grip. She could feel the narrative she'd spent 30 years carefully constructing, slipping right through her heavily manicured fingers. She tightened her hold on the thick metal stand of the microphone. She forced her glossy plastic smile wider, trying desperately to put a lid on the absolute panic leaking out of the golden boy standing next to her. She reached her hand out, aiming to rub Cole's broad shoulder in a public show of maternal comfort. She wanted to play his terror off as a joke. Cole jerked violently backward. He ripped his shoulder away from her reaching hand like she was a venomous snake about to strike. His heavy combat boots hit the hollow wooden stage. Thud, thud. He stepped right past her, leaving her arm hanging uselessly in the empty air. He closed the distance, standing right at the very edge of the stage, staring down at where I stood on the floor. "You are lying," Cole growled. He did not look back at Evelyn. He kept his blown-out eyes locked onto the dull brass pin fastened to the left side of my navy uniform. But he angled the microphone directly over his right shoulder, aiming his voice right at her face. "She is not some cowardly desk jockey. She's not a waste of space. And this stout family, you do not have the right to look down on her." The room went dead silent. The low buzzing murmur of the old-timers sitting in the back corner completely vanished. The clinking of beer glasses stopped. Evelyn's mask shattered. Her jaw dropped open. The tendons in her neck bulged against her cheap string of pearls. She lunged forward, grabbing the heavy base of the microphone with both hands. Her voice tore through the cheap PA speakers in a high-grating screech that made people in the front row flinch. "You are out of your mind. What is wrong with you?" She was practically spitting into the mic. "Did she pay you to say this? She bought you off with her little government paycheck, didn't she?" I did not open my mouth. You do not explain yourself to the enemy when they are already bleeding out on the floor. I pulled my right hand out of my uniform trouser pocket. The heavy brass Zippo lighter rested solid in the palm of my hand. The metal had absorbed the heat from my skin. I did not raise it high. I did not make a show of it. I just flicked my wrist and threw it. Clack! The heavy block of solid brass slammed down onto the scarred oak table sitting directly in front of the podium. The sharp, mechanical sound of metal hitting hard wood cut through the suffocating silence of the room like a gunshot. Cole stopped breathing. He stared down at the table. The harsh fluorescent overhead lights caught the deep, jagged scratches carved into the brass casing. The massive spider, the 4 words underneath. His knees actually buckled for a split second. He reached out and grabbed the heavy wooden edge of the podium to keep himself standing upright. A sheen of cold sweat broke out across his forehead, reflecting the harsh lights above. "Her," Cole said, pointing a shaking, unsteady finger directly at my chest. His voice was hoarse, scraping hard against his dry throat, but every single word was crystal clear over the speakers. "She is the one who pulled 7 Navy SEALs out of an absolute meat grinder in Bahrain. We were completely blind. We were flying straight into a rigged kill zone. If it was not for her tactical brain, if it was not for her hijacking the entire grid, our bones would be ash in the desert right now. She is the Black Widow." The absolute naked truth hit Evelyn like a runaway freight train. Her entire empire of lies, built carefully over 30 years to protect her own fragile narcissistic ego, collapsed in less than 10 seconds. All the blood drained out of her face, leaving her skin a sickly pale gray. Her knees gave out completely. She slumped forward, her hands clawing desperately at the edges of the wooden podium just to keep her body from hitting the floorboards. She slowly turned her head to look at me. The smug, arrogant disgust she had worn like a badge of honor for 3 decades was completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. She finally realized she had brought a cheap pocket knife to a drone strike. Down in the front row, a heavy wooden cane scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. Master Sergeant Miller, the meanest, most unforgiving Air Force veteran in the entire county, slowly pushed himself up from his metal folding chair. He stood up straight. His back, normally hunched with age, was completely rigid. He reached up with a liver-spotted hand and took off his faded ball cap, resting it on the table. He did not say a word. He did not cheer. He simply brought his right hand up and pressed it flat and hard against his left breast. A silent salute. The highest, most absolute form of respect, reserved only for those who actually hold the line when the bullets start flying. A second later, the heavy scrape of another chair echoed through the hall. A retired Marine stood up, mimicking the exact gesture. Then 2 more men stood. Then 10. A wave of movement washed over the hall. Every single veteran, every active duty officer, every civilian in that room pushed their chairs back and stood up in total, unbroken silence. Hundreds of people standing at absolute attention for the girl Evelyn had tried to bury in the mud. I kept my hands at my sides. My posture remained perfect. I looked right past Cole Mercer. I locked my eyes with my mother. She was trembling, gripping the podium like a drowning woman looking out at the massive sea of people, honoring the daughter she had thrown away. "Respect is bought with blood," I said. I did not use a microphone, but my voice carried across the dead quiet room, cold and heavy as iron. Not with cheap lies. The morning after the VFW haul, the house was dead. The heavy silence felt like the aftermath of an artillery strike. I sat alone at the kitchen table, the exact same wooden table where my military application had been ripped into 8 pieces. The air was thick and sour. A cheap drip coffee maker sat on the counter, the glass pot empty, the heating element burning the leftover coffee drops into a charred, bitter crust. The smell of burnt coffee filled the kitchen. I heard the slow, dragging shuffle of rubber slippers against the linoleum. Evelyn walked out of the hallway. The arrogant, untouchable president of the local chapter was completely gone. The woman standing in the doorway looked hollowed out. Her back was hunched. Her faded robe hung off her shoulders, wrinkled and loose. She did not look at me. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, avoiding my face like looking at me would physically burn her. She shuffled closer to the table. She reached a shaking hand out and ran her index finger over a dark, deep burn mark carved into the edge of the wood. It was a scar I accidentally made when I was 15, dropping a soldering iron. For 17 straight years, Evelyn had pointed at that exact burn mark every single time she wanted to remind me that I was clumsy, useless, a permanent mistake taking up space in her perfect house. Now her finger traced the charred wood, her hand trembling violently. The air in the kitchen was suffocating. Evelyn started. Her voice was paper thin. It cracked and splintered like dry wood. I didn't know. I did not move. I maintained the rigid, upright posture of an intelligence officer holding the line. My hands were folded loosely on the tabletop. My face was completely blank. "I was just so blind," she whispered, still staring at the burn mark. "I wanted a son for this family so badly. I wanted. She stopped. She sucked in a hard, raspy breath, struggling to pull oxygen into her lungs. In the military, an apology does not bring a dead operator back to base. An excuse does not pull a bullet out of a chest cavity. Words mean absolutely nothing when the damage is already permanent. I looked at the woman who had spent my entire life trying to drown me, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, just a cold, sweeping emptiness. "You did not need a son to bring honor to the stout family name, ma'am," I said. My voice was flat, cutting right through her stuttering excuses. "I handled that on my own." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut. Her shoulders collapsed completely. The crushing weight of a 30-year lie finally broke her spine. Her lips moved silently for a few seconds. She was fighting a brutal internal war just to form a single word. When she finally pushed it out of her mouth, it sounded agonizing, like she was chewing on broken glass. "Proud." She swallowed hard. "I am proud." It was a total unconditional surrender. The ultimate capitulation of a narcissist. She had completely stripped off her armor and handed me the exact word I'd been starving for since I was a child. I looked at her. I listened to the word. And I realized it was completely worthless. It was just scrap paper. Hearing that she was proud of me at 32 years old did not erase the welt from the yardstick on the back of my hand. It did not tape my Naval Academy application back together. It did not give me back the right to stand at the edge of my father's grave and drop a handful of dirt onto his casket. I did not cry. I did not stand up and pull her into a forgiving hug. I stood up. I pushed the heavy wooden chair backward. The wooden legs scraped hard against the linoleum tiles. Screech! The harsh grating noise made Evelyn flinch. I reached over and picked up my olive drab tactical backpack resting on the back of the chair. I slung the heavy canvas strap over my right shoulder. "Keep it," I said. I turned my back on her. I walked straight toward the back door. I did not stop to argue. I did not turn around to deliver a final screaming insult. The permanent wall between us was built entirely out of my absolute freezing indifference. You do not have to win the war against toxic blood, you just have to walk away. Late afternoon. The heavy mud terrain tires of my rental Jeep crunched hard over the loose gravel road winding through the town cemetery. I parked near the crest of the hill, throwing the heavy gear shift into park. The engine block ticked loudly, radiating heat as it slowly cooled down in the crisp autumn air. I pushed the heavy metal door open. The rusted hinges let out a high, sharp squeak. The golden hour sunlight was cutting straight through the thick, sprawling canopy of a massive, ancient oak tree. It threw long, stretched-out shadows across the damp, uneven grass. I walked past rows of weathered markers until I reached the back corner of the lot. I stopped in front of a heavy slab of polished black granite. My father's name was carved deep into the hard stone. I slid the tactical backpack off my shoulder. The heavy canvas hit the wet grass with a dull thud. I reached past the nylon webbing and pulled out the old framing hammer. The heavy steel head was chipped and scarred from driving thousands of nails. The wooden handle was worn completely smooth-stained dark with decades of his sweat sawdust and thick black machine grease. It was the only piece of his legacy I'd managed to drag out of that rusted industrial dumpster. I knelt down in the wet grass. The dampness immediately soaked right through the knees of my uniform trousers. I placed the hammer resting perfectly square on the flat concrete base of the headstone. I pressed the bare palm of my right hand flat against the cold, rough surface of the granite. For my entire adult life, my brain had been wired for combat. I had trained my body to lock my heart rate at a dead steady 60 beats per minute just to survive the crossfire. Emotion was a liability. Panic was a death sentence. But right then, kneeling in the dirt, touching that freezing stone, I finally turned the tactical system off. I unclenched my jaw. I let my chest heave. I let my heart hammer freely, wildly against my ribs. I allowed myself to just be a human being. "When I walked through the fire, the flames could not burn me down, Dad," I whispered. My voice was low and gravelly, instantly swallowed up by the sound of the wind rattling the dry oak leaves directly overhead. I looked down at the hammer. I saw his rough, calloused hands holding it in the dark kitchen. I saw the thick strips of clear packing tape catching the yellow light of his flashlight, holding the jagged, torn pieces of my Naval Academy application together. I remembered the heavy black marker pressing down, signing his name right over the top of Evelyn's pure hatred. I remembered the smell of motor oil rolling off his heavy canvas work jacket when he put his hand on my shoulder. My mother spent my entire childhood trying to bury me in the dirt. She wanted me scrubbing linoleum floors and shrinking myself down to fit into her miserable, suffocating little box. But he was the one who quietly handed me a loaded magazine. He handed me the sky. The flight took off, I said, tracing the carved sharp edges of his last name with my thumb. Mission accomplished. A heavy gust of wind swept up the side of the hill. It carried the sharp, clean smell of green pine needles and rich, damp earth. I closed my eyes, letting the freezing air hit my face. The crushing weight of the anger, the suffocating bitterness that had followed me around like a toxic, invisible ghost for 30 years, it just evaporated. It was pulled right out of my lungs and scattered into the wind. I felt the tight, knotted muscles in my shoulders finally drop. I was no longer carrying the heavy, useless luggage of the Stout family. The invisible chains Evelyn used to keep me tied to her massive ego had been completely severed. I cut them myself. I did not do it by screaming in the middle of a VFW hall. I did not do it by begging for her approval or waiting around a kitchen table for an empty apology that meant absolutely nothing. I did it with cold, hard truth. I was not the scapegoat anymore. I was not the filthy little girl banished to the backyard woodshop to bleed in the dark. I was Belen. I was the Black Widow. And I did not owe a single drop of my blood, my money, or my time to the people who happened to share my last name. I pushed myself up off the wet grass. I stepped back, bringing my heavy leather boots together. My heels clicked sharp against the gravel. I stood at the position of absolute rigid attention. I raised my right hand, bringing my fingertips up to the stiff brim of my officer's cover. I held a perfect razor-sharp military salute for 5 long seconds. The only salute that man ever received and the exact one he deserved. I dropped my arm. I turned my back on the grave. My boots hit the crushed stone pathway with heavy rhythmic thuds. My shadow stretched out long and dark in front of me, pointing straight down the hill toward the idling jeep. The real war never happened in the blistering deserts of Bahrain or the pitch-black trenches of Africa. The real war was pulling myself out of my mother's suffocating spiderweb of manipulation and surviving the venom. I looked up. There was no ceiling. There was no roof. The sky stretching out in front of me was wide open. It was blindingly bright, freezing cold, and absolutely, completely free. The greatest forgiveness is not accepting the person who crushed you, but shattering the chains yourself to take back your right to live. If you have ever had to leave toxic blood behind to protect yourself, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share the exact moment you found your own free sky down in the comments.